beautiful day today, so always makes a positive for a day when the sun is shining. Welcome to the session for this morning. We're going to be looking at leading and managing virtual teams, and sort of 4 key areas that we would like to go through. First of all, just looking, I think probably just to frame up this whole session this morning, looking at the benefits and challenges of remote working for the individual, and also just talk through a couple of those points for a manager, because it does pose, I mean, you know, lots of benefits, but also there's challenges. And we find, as you can probably see with most things, there's always a bit of a yin and a yang. There's always a positive and a negative. There's always winners and losers. There's always the good and the bad. So likewise with leading and managing a virtual team, we want to just look at that and look at the things that are good and the challenges. Effective communication is absolutely paramount. It's a topic which is paramount whether we have a virtual team or not in all businesses. So we'll just have a look at that and talk through the communication cycle and process, which kind of makes some understanding of why we need to step our communication up, particularly with a virtual team. That will lead into a piece that Alex will talk us through, looking at leadership. We do need to practice some really good leadership skills. And I also think that you know, sort of having a virtual team and running virtual teams really it's exciting, in as much as it really will step those managers' skills up. And I think if you can lead and manage a virtual team really successfully, you could probably, you know, you probably learned some really great skills to lead any team in the workplace or otherwise. So I think that's a bit that we'd like to look at. And then to close off, look at some topics with 8 key points to get the best out of our teams when we're managing them virtually. Maybe a couple of controversial bits that we'll be talking about and get your thoughts on. But we'll look at some key tips and sort of practices that we think are really, really paramount when managing a team virtually. So if I just head through and let's just talk first of all about some of these benefits of remote working. And no doubt you'll be, for those of you that have been working from home, either through lockdown or before, one of the key things is this flexibility and this freedom that sort of remote working can offer. And if you're thinking about there's people working from home and we hear it, I say to myself, it's really nice not to be out on the roads travelling, you know, travelling up north for 4 hours and back and having these really long days. So if there's less travel and less commuting time, then ultimately that's going to have an impact on staff morale. And that's really quite a big benefit to this remote working that a lot of us will be experiencing. And if we're impacting on morale, then that's going to have a real positive on people's well-being. We all know busy mums, busy dads, that work-life balance, massive positive. So if you've got, and the interesting thing, you know, with that is that one of the things that in a virtual team is this piece on trust. You can see one of the points in there on building trust. We need to create the ability as managers and teams to trust our people. So, you know, if you've got your little one that's, you know, got their school play or their football or whatever, having that work-life balance to just go and see that, rather than perhaps being in the workplace where you're having to seek that permission to go, you can just go, and maybe you start your work at 6 o'clock in the morning. So having that work-life balance and having control over that, again, is a real morale booster and be good for well-being. And research is saying that it can increase productivity. And of course, you've got that global capability, so anybody can be in your virtual team. So that's a real positive. There is a lot of research. We know there's lots of research out there and continues to be done, but the attraction and retaining of staff is a real big one. And they're saying that I mean, I'm sure maybe some of these figures have increased, but some of the studies are saying that, you know, probably about 35% of employees, that's probably higher, would probably change their job role or go to a job that gives them the ability to have that flexibility and that remote working. Some of the stats that have been shown previously are saying that if people have around sort of 60 to 80%, 3 to 4 working days of a 5 working day week where they can be remote working, that it really can have an impact on productivity. So just interesting stuff that's out there. And of course, if you're retaining your top talent and attracting, talent, then that's going to make you as a business more competitive. So looking at all these, you know, benefits, I think that's a real positive. So there's always the yin and the yang. So lots of benefits, which you'll all be familiar with, I'm sure. But of course, it comes with the challenges. So what we were going to ask is if we could just put it open to the chat, and we're just going to ask what you're experiencing or what you see as some of the challenges for yourselves, either you're experiencing yourselves that you're aware of. And perhaps we just put some of those into the chat, if you can do that now, just before we go through onto our next slide.
So we've got Emma here that's saying people feeling isolated and struggling with mental health.
Yeah,
is definitely an important one. Training and onboarding remotely. We've got being disciplined about switching off at the right time, team cohesion, missing the face-to-face support, especially when you've got challenging work. Sometimes a cup of tea and a chat really helps, absolutely.
Low mood's a good one as well, the low mood and keeping your motivation. Oh, that's a good one, Geraldine. Managing staff who are underperforming. Yes, we'll pick up on that. Taking breaks, taking breaks. Yeah, staff members requiring more supervision, that's a challenge. Because one of the things that's really interesting in some of those comments there is that when you look at a lot of the research, a lot of the research, when you know, and sort of tips on managing virtual teams, they're saying pick your team. Pick those people that can work virtually, you know, successfully. But we haven't got that choice with lockdown. We have the team we have, and we are working virtually. So yes, that's a good point. Training staff, yeah. About people working too many hours, yeah, becoming personally inefficient and switching off.
Some really good points in here. Yeah,
all very valid points. Very valid points. Anything else just coming through there? Learning from colleagues by observing how they behave and speak to customers and colleagues. Yeah, and I think probably, I mean, it's happening already from lots of people talking about it. Sort of new policies for how to work remotely is definitely something that needs to be happening. Loss of team culture. Yes, we need to perhaps recreate the team culture. Yeah, okay. And allocating time to talk with staff outside normal meetings. Yeah, I think that's really important. One of the things that we'll just come through and talk about is how do you have your water cooler chat? You know, because we're losing the water cooler chats. Okay. Yeah, that's really good. Okay, so that's some really good points in there. Yeah, dealing with disciplinary issues. Good stuff. So I'm just going to put on the next slide here, and we'll just go through some of these points. And I think particularly dealing with some of these disciplinary issues and underperformance is just something I think we can pick up on some of the key tips as we go through, because everything's great. We're all talking about one of the benefits is that we need to build trust. And it's all very well having people saying, well, yes, to build a virtual team, you need to pick the right people. But that's not always going to be the case. So we need to be thinking about how we manage that. Okay, so let's just have a look through some of these challenges here on the next slide. So, you know, key things we talked about that are coming up, you know, that sense of remoteness and isolation. And one of the things that we'll talk about later on just in the session is actually how, you know, what some of the stuff that's out there talking about the introverts and the extroverts, because we all actually can feel a bit lonely. So some interesting stuff there that we'll talk about how we manage them. You know, there is this lack of social workplace life. And as human beings, we naturally like that interaction. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about introverts and extroverts, but that's a natural thing. So even though we're losing that connection, we need to think about how we're going to engage and connect with our people in a different way. Interruptions, massive challenge, big challenge. So, you know, and if again you've got certain personality types, some people will be more prone to being interrupted and off on another tangent than other people. And you may have bad health habits. So is there anybody that's constantly in the larder or in the fridge? And that box of chocolates that's just under the chair that you have one every night, you just have one in the morning as well. So, you know, you've got those things that are starting to sneak in. You know, it was picked up, somebody just picked up about the working hours. So that we know is a key challenge. And from some of our customers that we're dealing with, they're saying that I'm just working too hard and I need to manage that. And the communication element with remote working, as in business day to day, and it's no difference to working remotely, we have the challenge of miss, over and lack of communication. But that's a challenge in business as a whole, but how do we manage that more efficiently with a remote team? And we've got to be really careful with our management and leadership style, because a big challenge will be to micromanage. And of course, we have to think about the people who are underperforming, but that is a temptation that we need to be mindful of. And one of the key tips that we're going to talk about at the end is just thinking about what are the resource and equipment that you have, and also the kinds of processes and the working systems, the standards that you have. So, you know, it's a challenge because I think we probably need to think about setting some clear standards, you know, how people respond back to you, because really you want people coming to you. You don't want to have to be going to them all the time. And this is what I'm seeing, you know, as we're working with virtual teams. If we can get our skills as a leader and a manager really working well, that's going to work dividends for any teams in or outside of the workplace. So heading through onto the next slide here, if I could just move that through onto communication. So important to find this balance, as we said, between this under and over communicating, and also to think about how we minimize miscommunication. The stats are showing in any case about 80% of problems in businesses are generally down to poor interpretation of miscommunication. You've got a double whammy there, poor communication, and then it's misinterpreted as well. So it's probably more than 80%. So if we have that issue in the workplace, how is that going to be advanced if we're working with a remote team? And it's really important that we have a clarity in our expectations and messages. And one of the key things with managing a remote team is actually spending more time and detail on making sure people are clear on the expectations. Again, this is where I think it's good management practice. So get the detail, don't focus so much on the actual activity, but focus more on what's the expectation, what are the key objectives, what's the outcome. So we'll talk about that when we go through some of the key tips in at the end. And again, when you look at this, you're thinking, well, Kath, you know, this is stuff that we should be doing standard. But again, I think even more so, we need to make sure that our team and individuals are very clear on what they've got to do, why they're doing it. So we've got them bought in, because we need them bought in. When are they doing it and how? That's standard stuff, but we've got to up this level. So I think this is really going to test those management skills and those leadership skills. And here's where it can go wrong and right. This is your classic communication process. And the key bit here that we're going to just cover is this piece on feedback. If I think that I'm the manager, I'm that source, and I've got to give an instruction to a member of my team, then I've got to encode that. So this is where my skills as a manager and a communicator has to be good. I need to have clarity in what I'm asking, so I need to be very clear, but also it's the way I'm putting across, it's my tonality, it's my time of day, it's the encoding of that message. And how am I going to do that? So one of the things we need to think about later is, what are the best channels for me to communicate my message? Is it going to be by email? Is it going to be a Zoom, a Microsoft Teams, a Blue Jeans, whatever your, or Skype? Is it going to be through some other form of media? So I need to make sure that I'm choosing that right method, that right channel to send my message across to either my team or my individuals. We then have the challenge of the receiver who's got to decode my message. So if we have working practices, I'm trying to communicate with a member of my team, and I know the children are in the background, they're having to homeschool, the doorbell's just gone, and I've got I've got all my stuff coming in from Amazon, I've got the dog barking, I've got this going on, the rabbits just got out, I've seen them running across the lawn, it's all going on, we're hearing it all, you're going to be distracted, and that all will diminish. That's going to be clouding in somebody's head. So all of that, as well as trying to understand what I'm trying to communicate, is making that communication process difficult. The receiver needs to decode my message. So we've got to be better at listening for that feedback. And one of the points that we're going to just cover, at the very end, is very much with everything, is to be guided by the feedback. Because a lot of the things that we might be thinking are sort of norms, particularly with how people might be acting and behaving, some of those people that might be very planned and organised naturally, there might just be stuff going on that pushes them out of their norms. So we need to be listening to that feedback. The meaning of the message is the response you get. The meaning of the message is the response you get. So if I've communicated something and it's not happening, this is where we just need to be coming back to ourselves and thinking, could I have communicated that in a different way? What's the space that my colleague is in? And just listen to that feedback and be guided by that. And I think that's a key element in this communication process, which we need to be mindful of. Alex, have you got anything to add on to that?
Absolutely. Communication is, I was just going back to some of the challenges that people were sharing earlier on, and I picked up on something. And following on from communication, the question that we have is, I would say that, best management practice still applies in this situation. The key question to all of this will be about, it's fundamentally, how do we communicate? How do we communicate the objectives, the targets, the goals? How do we communicate the culture? How do we communicate those expected behaviors to people? So communication underpins everything that we do. And actually, because we're now working in a remote environment, communication and leadership are probably the two most fundamental principles that we need to be able to rely on. And I'm just going to control the PowerPoint now. If we consider how to overcome some of these challenges that were mentioned, what we're actually looking at is how we lead and inspire and drive our teams to high performance, which, when we consider leadership and management as a context and a subject and a skill set, ultimately, that's what we're trying to do in any given situation. The difference now is that people are further away from us. They're remote. There's periods of time where, as managers and leaders, we're not necessarily watching, seeing, or physically interacting with our teams. We're not picking up on those subtle signals, or those times that we will just simply observe and watch what's happening, which perhaps reduces the amount of good information that we may have. So we just want to spend a few minutes now looking at the concept of leadership and really how important the skills of leadership are right now, because this is what will help us manage our teams extremely well. And it's also worthwhile noting that a lot of managers and team managers and line leaders out there, they've been put into this situation, and we've worked we've been training leaders and managers for 15 years. And throughout our experience, it's perhaps unsurprising how many people do not have the necessary skills at their fingertips. The amount of times we go into situations and people just, you can see the light bulbs turning on. That's crucial now. So with leadership, we're looking what the concepts of leadership are, and it's exactly as people say, values, the behaviors. People need to feel connected. They need to share the vision, purpose, and drive of the organization. And ultimately, people need to feel cared for and trusted. So the question I would pose, and it's worthwhile thinking about for the next few minutes, is how can we deliver these in a remote working environment? And we can do that through understanding what our challenges are and how best we can overcome them using some key leadership skills. So just to sort of talk more about the specific challenges we may find in our teams, and they are shared, and it's clear that all of you are experiencing some of these. There's the people are working on their own. They're going to feel isolated. There's going to be times when people feel disconnected. It's worthwhile remembering that people come to work not just to achieve a task or a role. There's the social side of it. There's the engagement side. People need to feel that they have a sense of purpose and that they have a sense of value. So you take those away from the physical aspect, and there's a lot more going on. People are worried, they're anxious, there's a higher emotional response. There's all sorts of emotions floating out there. So emotional intelligence is really important now. We're talking about communication. What are the communication patterns? We're having to change. We're in a process of change. And this process of change is evolving and adapting at a very, very quick rate. So, whenever we do work on change, we talk about the importance of leadership. People need to know that there is someone who is thinking about the future, that there is a vision, and there is something that they can buy into. We're not physically present. So as I've said, we don't pick up on those clues. And now what we're doing is we're asking our managers and our leaders to really excel. So we're saying, all right, what we're going to do is we're going to take your team away from you, and we're going to put them all in different parts of the world or different parts of the country. Now do your job even better than you used to do it. So it's not rocket science to work out that people may be struggling with that. So there's some really important skills that our managers need to develop, and they're going to be worried. They're going to be challenged. They're going to be anxious, and so that temptation will be to micromanage. The temptation will be to maintain control. A manager is valued, and their performance is valued on the output of their team and the people within those teams. So there will be a strong temptation to try and control that as much as possible, which leads to micromanagement. As we all know, micromanagement can send a strong message of mistrust. Yes, people need to be managed, and yes, some people need to be managed very closely, and we'll look at that in just a second. So to try and sort of overcome these challenges, we picked up on 3 key leadership styles, and it's worthwhile just pausing here for a second. There's lots of people out there that don't know anything about leadership styles. There's lots of people out there that be very intuitive. They will work from their gut. They will work from what they think is the best. And it's worthwhile spending some time with your teams and with your managers, just checking to see what their knowledge is of how they can adapt and flex their leadership and their communication style. So we picked on 3 that are very important at the moment. To delegate. So we need to be able to delegate the right tasks to people, to our teams. We need to understand what their current level of expertise is, work through any training. And I saw that training had come up on the chat function. We can certainly speak about that. But we also need to be able to delegate the responsibility and the authority to people. We need to be aware of what do they need, what are the resources they're going to need. And we need to think this through. We need to think what people have they got everything that they need? Where might they be struggling? And then when we delegate that task, it's our job to then go in and help and coach people to perform. Now, when we're delegating effectively, that's how we empower people. And when we're empowering our teams, it allows us to recognize fantastic achievement. If we don't put a process in for people to achieve, then it's more difficult to truly recognize that achievement, all of which builds engagement towards our companies. Another key leadership style is to coach. So coaching effective performance, encouraging people to problem solve, encouraging people to think for themselves, encouraging people to recognize what they already know in some cases, and guiding people to what they may need to develop. It's a follow on from delegating because people will need support. Again, by adopting a coaching leadership style, we're allowing people to take ownership, we're encouraging drive, and we're encouraging, you know, more intrinsic motivation. So there's less focus on what can you do for me and more what can I achieve. But we have to encourage people to do that. You know, people will consistently, our teams will consistently come to us, and they will ask and they will ask. And if we keep feeding, then that's the relationship we build. So we need to start pushing back to them, encouraging people to think for themselves. If we're doing that, if we're stretching and challenging people, we need to support them. We need to take time to listen. We actually need to seek to understand, and we need to seek to empathize. And more so because we've lost those obvious cues. You know, what are we seeing in the office? Well, the person A is struggling with person B, and I can see that because it's right in front of me, or I've got someone else, you know, sort of feeding that in. Well, we may have lost that. So we need to spend time just to talk to our teams, build that relationship, build trust. And that's where, you know, we're building loyalty, trust, and we're building effective communication. Now, I know that there are people, and it's come up already as a challenge, who will need to be managed closely, and that's absolutely fine. What I would say in terms of choosing our leadership styles is, number one, make sure our managers are aware that there are different leadership styles they can choose. Make sure that they know what's involved in each of them, and make sure that they're not assuming. The danger will be to assume that we have to control tightly to get the output we need, but that can have long-term negative effects. We're looking at sustainability here. We're in a new pattern of working. We need to try and get the impact of all these benefits that Kath spoke about earlier on, and that's about increasing our skills as leaders. So just to touch on some of the key sort of tips and hints. You know, have an open door policy. You know, speak to people, allow them time to come and show an interest in both what they're doing at home, in their home life, and also professionally as well. Discuss and agree goals. That's very important. You know, delegate the authority and the resources as well as the task, and get people to agree, get their buy-in on those goals. Provide timely feedback. Now, this is really important and something that people sometimes don't think about. If I'm doing something, or if I'm worried about something, or I don't know quite what it is I need, I may not speak up. And you can't see that because we're not there in front of everybody. So you need to provide the feedback when it's timely, when it's the right time, usually fairly quickly, but make sure that you are doing it in the right way. So constructive with a positive end and focusing on the outcome. You know, recognize good performance, and I think it's really important here to recognize effort just as well as results. You know, that's crucial. It's standard practice. It's worthwhile highlighting now. Don't be overly critical. And I think we talked about empathy here. Think about what the other people or the teams are experiencing. Communicate with that in mind. Diffuse situations, and be constructive when we're asking people to change their methods or change what they're doing, or getting them to redo something as well. Show interest in potential challenges. You know, what are people doing? Kath talked about this earlier. What are their home life challenges? You know, I certainly know that homeschooling is very challenging, and I'm not, you know, if I'd ever considered doing it, I wouldn't consider again. So what are these challenges? How does it affect people? And then also encourage people to problem solve. Give them help, but throw the ball back into, or sort of bat the ball back into their court initially. And this is important. I'll focus on this for a second. When we encourage shared leadership, it's a concept of leaders and leadership. What we can do is we can recognize potential leaders in our team. We can stretch them. You know, who's there to mentor? I saw 4 or 5 challenges come through that could be really well worked by assigning mentors and assigning people to help develop, grow, and coach, and be there for people who are perhaps struggling. So recognize those potential leaders, and that also grows your team. It grows that leadership culture within your team. You know, adapt your leadership style to the individual. Consider, you know, what their key motivators are. Consider the personality, which Kath is going to talk to in just a second, and be ready to change it, not just for the situation, but for each person. Think about how you communicate. Think about, how am I delivering that message? You know, think about your tone of voice. Think about your body language, which is hugely important. You know, classically, sales training says that or customer service training, when you pick up the phone, you adopt the right body language. The same thing applies. Think about your communication channels, you know, and adapt those for your personality. If someone needs more contact time, well, then perhaps you can give it, or you can recognize someone else who can do that. So really be aware of your team's needs and your individual needs. And then, you know, be approachable, be authentic, and be adaptable. You know, be ready to talk to people. Set the times, set the guidelines. You know, I would say that it's a mixture between the right process and the right leadership style. Be authentic. And when we say authentic, just be true to your values. And we talked about culture. How do we breed culture? Well, you know, I think in a remote working environment, it's leading by example and using that shared leadership to really breed that culture in terms of how we communicate, how we deal with problems, and how we treat people, and be ready to change. And this is another sort of avenue that people sometimes fall into. They're stuck in their own ways. Well, this has worked before, I'm going to do it again. So we need to be adaptable, and we need to adapt to the situation and be flexible. And ultimately, we need to show our personalities, and we need to understand, you know, other personalities. A sense of humor is great. It helps diffuse situations. And sometimes people just need a different perspective on things as well. So sort of just to summarize, you know, leadership is absolutely crucial in any situation. It's just exacerbated and perhaps slightly difficult to communicate those values and those behaviors that we would expect from our teams when they're there with us all the time. So, and I think just to consider, you know, the concept of personality and understanding people. Kath, I know that you've got some insights here.
Yes, yeah, okay, let's have a look. Yeah, thanks, Alex. So you're probably picking up, as I am, some really good, just standard management, good practice and leadership practice is needed here. And I think, you know, for a manager and a leader to be understanding personalities and how you work with your team, again, just vital skills. What's been really interesting is the amount of research that seems to be being done at the moment with us all going into lockdown with how we manage our introverts and extroverts. And I've had some really interesting examples over the last month when I've been talking and working with some of our clients, and I'll share a particular example with you in a few moments. But when you think about sort of introverts and extroverts, a lot of that study, some of you will be familiar with the Myers-Briggs type indicator, MBTI, and a little bit of misconception there with the introverts and extroverts. On Myers-Briggs, it's introversion and extroversion. It's how you are energized, which MBTI looks at. And often people have said to me, yeah, well, I'm an introvert, Kath, you know, and yeah, but, you know, and I'm really out there, I'm really near, I'm really out there. It's how an introvert can act in an extroverted way. So on Myers-Briggs, you're looking at introversion and extroversion and how you get your energy. And that's the important thing to remember. It's how you are energized. And what can happen is historically, we tend to stereotype our introverts and extroverts. And even studies have been done. I mean, there are some studies that was done back in 2018 where they spent a week looking at sort of the different levels of extroverted behaviour. And they had, you know, all these people, and they were seeing the typical study that the extroverts were sort of up in their feelings and their mood and quite energised, but the introverts didn't really see much benefit and actually were sort of getting quite tired and irritable. And that kind of study just generally supports what we would, you know, sort of, you know, stereotype introvert, extrovert. And thinking about all the social distancing rules now, it's kind of like, you know, the introverts, this is they've been training all these years to have lockdown. This is their training coming into practice. You know, this is their moment of their whole life when they can really be their introvert. And we've got to be really careful with that, because I'm seeing a real difference. And there's, you know, this recent sort of article in the New York Times, you know, yes, even introverts can be lonely right now. And what was really interesting with a lady that I was working with back in April, and again, forgive me if I'm using Myers-Briggs, but in her type, for those of you that are familiar, she's an ISTJ. So she's very high. She's quite extreme on the continuum for introversion. So she gets her energy from within, sensing. So she's very detailed, you know, a little bit detached, you know, sort of detached from emotion in her T, very planned and organised. But it was the I that's really interesting. And I've been doing some work with her, and very private and self-contained. Has taken quite a while for me to kind of get underneath and get to know her. The other interesting thing that we did is we had done some work with her around her motivations. And I think this is something just, it kind of just blew me away. I guess I know this stuff, but when you're actually seeing it and getting the example, it kind of blows me away. And in this sort of profiling tool that we use, motivational mapping, one of the motivations, it talks about your friend. People go to work because their friends are there, because they like the interaction with people. We're all motivated by this, but it depends on the strength and the degree. But we all are motivated by going to work and being around people and having that human interaction to some degree. And for her, it was in her top motivations, but it wasn't being met. And she's had some challenges. She had a bereavement earlier on in the year, so that wasn't helping. And I said to her, I said, Nicola, I said, you know, how are you feeling at the moment? She said, Cash, she said, I've really learned something about myself. I didn't realise how much I needed people around me. She said, I thought I would be quite happy being in lockdown and being at home in my own space with her little cat. She said, but I've actually learned that I'm actually quite demotivated because I'm not really having that interaction with other people. And she also referred to the water cooler chats and going to the coffee machine. And to me, I just thought that's absolutely fascinating. And it sets in my mind, because I'm very into sort of this personality and motivation, I think it's fascinating stuff, is that do not underestimate and do not stereotype your people in your team. You will naturally know the classic introvert, extrovert. You'll probably classically know them, but don't underestimate that we can all get lonely and we need that level of interaction. And I said some of the studies are showing that this, you know, that actually introverts and extroverts, you know, all the stereotypes actually can be a bit of a myth. So I think that's really interesting. So when we think of what we've got to be mindful of, in your personality type, there's other things that will play into that. And I think the key thing here is to be guided by feedback. I'll just come back to that second point there, but be guided by feedback, and that will be reminding you about the difference of your people and their personalities. I've just put that little note in there, be mindful of your JP. Again, on Myers-Briggs, it's your judging and perceiving, and that's how organised you are. So for some people, they'll be really planned, organised, structured, but you know, being at home, that might be a challenge. Somebody who's in perceiving, there's somebody who's more out there, less structured. So again, just be very mindful that, you know, these stereotypes in our personality can be challenged when you're in different workspaces. How many times do you hear people say, I'm different at work than I am at home? I hear that loads. I hear that a real lot. Yes, when I'm at work, I'm this type, and when I'm at home, I'm that type. So again, just be guided by the feedback, listen to people and help and support them, because some may need more structure than perhaps we think. So I think that's just a really interesting point to be mindful of. So let's just go into some of these final points. I'm just going to just see if I can thumbnail you down. So we've got eight points here just to go through, I think, to really help think about how we successfully manage a virtual team. And I think one of the first things that we're talking about here, sorry, is, let me just come back on that slide, forgive me there. Yeah, define those clear working systems. People have different ways of going about tasks, and of course when they're working remotely, they will all definitely have their own way that will be difficult for you to manage. So you may need to set some clear standards. And we put in here, for example, define a standard of being responsive. You know, if we're trying to build trust, we need people to be coming to us. We don't want to be on their case all the time. So all of those times when you're perhaps at work and it's, oh, how's it going? Oh, did you manage to get that done? You know, all these little things that we put in as managers, we don't have that now. So maybe we need to be setting some standards of when our employees come back to us. Maybe that's something that would be a good standard to set in any workplace, not just for remote teams. So what are those clear working systems? Make sure that we've got a real combination of communication tools that we use as a team. And how do we, if we've got an urgent matter, what's the best tool for that? Is that just pick up the phone? Actually, that is pick up the phone. Let's not do this email for urgent matters. Let's actually get a bit more smart with how we're using the communication tools. Maybe we use our Zoom or Blue Jeans or Teams for our team meeting, or a brief update, maybe for an individual one-to-one. And how do we use email? So I think if we're talking about engagement and engaging our people and making them feel a part of the organisation, which is a really interesting one, we need to think about using these face-to-face tools and using these effectively. So what tool is used for what? I think would be something good, really good to set. So use project management tools as well, because you're going to be thinking about how do you keep track of work and deadlines. So here at Turning Factor, over the last 12 to 18 months, we've been putting all of our documents onto SharePoint, for example. Never done that before. Oh my goodness, am I so pleased that we have done that. So, I've got Alex, he's been working at home, I've been working at home, and we've both been working on this presentation example together at the same time. So, making good use of those tools, when you've got a virtual team is absolutely paramount, and that has paid dividends for certainly us here at Turning Factor. Have clear expectations on what the deliverables are. So we don't want to be micromanaging here. So this is a key bit, and I think a real change with a virtual team is to spend time being clear on what's expected. We always have believed it's good practice at the beginning of the week to set your objectives. So I will sit there at the beginning of the week and I'll be thinking, right, by the end of Friday, I want to achieve this, 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 and this. That's generally how I've operated. So I think even more so at the beginning of the week, okay, JC, let's have a one-to-one, a quick call. What are the key things that you are going to be achieving at the end of the week? So you're focusing, yes, you want to get in some detail, but you are focusing more on the results and what needs to be achieved rather than the actual activity. Because you've got to trust them to carry that out. Yes, you'll talk about that, but make sure you are very clear about what those objectives are to be achieved. And I think that's a really good point for very much so for virtual teams. So this spending time building a strong team relationship, rebuilding the culture. And I think you can rebuild that culture back. Just needs good management and leadership. We have one of our clients, we were chatting to him yesterday, a gentleman, and his team is now all remote, of course. And he said, Kathy, I asked them what they wanted. And he said, we've now ended up having a team chat in the morning, and sometimes I'll chat with individuals during the day, but we'll have a team chat in the afternoon, and that's really working well. Twice a day. Yeah, that's what they wanted, and they're really enjoying it. So everything, I think there is no set way, everything's going to work differently, but it's really important that you make them feel included day to day. And again, just relating, we're a business, we have employees and people. I can remember one of the things, Alex will smile now, that when we first went down into lockdown, for us, it was like starting up a brand new business again, and getting everything online. And I remember one of the comments, Alex, you made to me was, I'm kind of feeling a little bit out of it, guys, we're not communicating enough. Well, that's a wake-up call, yeah. So you need to be making your people feel included. We've been learning from that too. And make time to reinvent the water cooler. Have your virtual morning coffee and cake. No work, just have your morning coffee. 11 o'clock was almost my 11sies, and have your coffee and cake or your afternoon tea. That is good time well spent. Ensure that you're scheduling regular meetings, both team and one-to-one, so people will we are a little bit of creatures of habit. It's nice to have that routine and consistency. So on a Monday morning, we're doing this. We're checking your objectives. We're doing this. On a Tuesday afternoon at 1 o'clock, Josie, you're going to call me and we'll just have an update. So this is about raising the level of accountability and trust, which is all in your empowerment. So get some of these routines and consistency and be available to your team as a manager as well. And just some last points here. It's an interesting one on sort of working hours, because it's nice to have your team available to each other. So perhaps no harm if somebody wants sort of, to start at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, because that's when they're on top form, through to midday, and then, sort of overlaps maybe from 10 to 3, or it doesn't matter. But if you've got some working hours that overlap, to allow people that flexibility to work different hours, we do need to make sure that there's people there to support each other, and that availability. But it can be a really effective practice. And one of our points, this last point is an interesting one. I don't really want to go onto a meeting on Zoom and look at somebody who's got their dressing gown on. Not really. I'd like to look at somebody who's maybe, sort of appropriately dressed to go to work. So, I've got up every day, and I put my makeup on and I've come down. And yes, I might have just had perhaps a jumper on or something that I might not wear to a client meeting or into the office, but I've got appropriately dressed for the day to go to work. And on many occasions, at the end of my day, I get changed for my evening. So that's how I operate. But I think, I think being appropriately dressed, I think we should perhaps encourage our virtual teams to do that, perhaps just to avoid the working in our pajamas. And see if we can get them to create that workspace, which is very difficult, we know, but see if we can encourage our people to create that workspace which is a bit free from distraction. I think could be really helpful to create that virtual, it's just creating a professional workspace. And if you're feeling professional, and again, it just plays back, as we all know, that, when you're wearing, you're dressed up, you're smart, it helps you feel good. And I think it's really important that we don't let some of those standards drop. If they're coming to work and working for you, then what are the standards that we're going to create? There we are. I think that leads us just through to the end. So thank you very much for that. I hope there's really been some useful things on there, and perhaps some questions from anybody if you want to put any of those through. Yeah.
Thank you, Kathryn, Alex. That was fantastic. Loads and loads and loads of really important bits of pieces to think about there, and some great tips as well. Just going to give another few minutes in case people are writing some questions. We haven't had anything through yet. So John said, any thoughts about coping with hot weather?
Yeah, I think it's, well, that's an interesting one, because coping in the hot weather, I mean, it's a really difficult one it just drains you, doesn't it? So you've got to think about where you're working first of all, I think is a key thing. And I think also that can also have an impact on your working hours. So where you're working in the house, just be careful that you're not working in the sunroom. And I'd be very mindful that you don't get yourself hot in the first place. So yes, I mean, it's the classics of drinking plenty of water. We had this lady, I mean, I was starting to work in my sunroom. I've now changed that to work in a different room because I'm just getting too hot to begin with. So I think it's maybe, particularly in the very hot weather at home, you've got, see if you can find that coolest space to be able to work. I think is a real key thing there. Yeah,
and I suppose
well-being stuff, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. And I suppose it might come into it, some people could be requesting to change their working hours to maybe enjoy the hot weather and have more breaks during the day. And I suppose it comes back to setting the standards of what you expect, doesn't it?
And this is the whole point, which I think is the change, rather than, because this is about focusing on the results and the outcome. You tell me what you're wanting to achieve at the end of the week. As long as you've achieved that, do whatever it's like the salesperson, isn't it? As long as you hit the target, I don't care what you do. You know, go to many coffee breaks and I don't care, just hit your target. And I think that's very much what we've got, and we're trusting them to do that because they're out on the road. So I think a lot of that practice, what we're seeing and hearing, experiencing, and researching is that, you know, this is what we need to be doing with our virtual teams to allow them to have that flexibility. Because if you can imagine giving somebody, you know, sort of midday, they can have a couple of hours in the sun, knowing that they're not going to be shouted at, but they're going to get their work, providing they get their work done, how motivating is that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Great point.
Yeah, thank you. And Glyn has asked, how do you ensure safe homework practices?
Well, I think this is where we need to be changing policies and procedures. I know it's been coming up. We wholeheartedly agree. I've been talking to one of our colleagues on this who sort of looks at policies and practices, and I think that there need to be certain standards in place. And I think there needs to be probably some kind of tick box. I mean, we've been talking about it, so I think it's a really interesting one. And we were just talking about ideas around getting employees to do a home-based sort of survey, or maybe take a picture of where their working space is. Is that work? Is it safe? I mean, we're going to have to put a lot of trust in here, but we are definitely going to have to set some standards and get our employees to sign to those, because of course that's going to be at their own risk, but we need to have that sense of duty. So I think that's one of the key things that I've been having a chat with my colleague that needs to change in policies and procedures.
If I can just jump in and add on that as well, there are home risk assessments available out there as well. So for people who are working as remote workers, because before this happened, then it was process and policy to risk assess your environment and your working, which you can then feed into your HR processes, and you can make those, you can make those electronic and virtual as well.
Yeah, definitely needs to be tightened up.
Great, thank you. We've got some, sorry, yeah.
I was just checking that we covered the question on underperformance okay, because I think, just quickly, I think if you've got somebody who is underperforming, I think it's the same principle and practices that apply. Yes, it's going to be tricky. You may have to micromanage them a bit more, but hey, if maybe you gave them a bit more freedom and upped your skills as a manager to be very clear, because if you've got somebody that's underperforming, what do? You set them a clear plan of action. What do you need to achieve? This is what is expected. So I think maybe that will up your skills as a manager to make sure that's happening. Of course, if it's then not being achieved, then it's down disciplinary routes. So I think, we just need to be testing our skills, I really think, as leaders, managers.
And if I can jump in on that one as well, it's worthwhile for those of you who can do it, is to perhaps get a skills, some form of ongoing skills assessment and development for your managers themselves. Where are they comfortable? What do they know? What don't they know? What have they experienced? What haven't they experienced? Because the performance management system, just to echo what Kathryn said, is no different in its concept. It's about how we then deliver that in a remote environment, and are our managers skilled and able to do those variety of different elements that are included in that.
Absolutely. Mike has just made a valid point where they're spotting there's a difference between managing virtual teams and leading virtual teams, and it takes a lot of energy to get it right and select the right style and mode. So leadership is crucial as well as management. I think we'd agree with that.
Absolutely, I go that.
Totally agree with that. And that's all about, making sure that you're, all the management stuff is the setting of the standards and the objectives, all the good management stuff, which we so need. But you've so got to be in leadership space. And one of the biggest behaviours in leadership is trust. And if you can trust your teams, to deliver and go and do things and empower them, leadership behaviour, and be a good communicator, leadership, have that vision, share, keep them engaged. That's absolutely crucial. Totally agree with that. Totally agree.
And I think just to echo that as well, leadership, I love that comment. I love that statement. Both are extremely important. One of the key challenges is that, our managers and our people leading our teams can be frustrated as well. And it's important that they demonstrate, how they cope with those frustrations, and how they communicate that or don't communicate it as well. And that's all in the leadership space, So it's so important to have the management, which is the combination between process and leadership, process, leadership. And we got to find that balance. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of thank yous coming through on the chat as well. So I'd like to add to that and say thanks to you guys, Alex and Kath, for delivering the session today. I don't think we've got any more questions, but if you do have any more questions, the contact details for Turning Factors just on your screen there. So feel free to get in touch and make contact. That's absolutely great. So I think we'll leave it there for today and say goodbye to you all, and thanks for joining, and we'll see you again soon, hopefully.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye.